This is the Mixed Martial Arts Beat for the third week of March 2014. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. Another week, another episode of the show, and what a Saturday night it was last weekend in Dallas, Texas, as Johny Hendricks became the new UFC welterweight champion. There's a lot to discuss as it pertains to the UFC's 170-pound weight class, and of course a whole lot more going on in the world of mixed martial arts, so let us get right into it. Luke Thomas of the Sirius XM Fight Club and MMAfighting.com is in the house. Jeff Wagenheim of Sports Illustrated, and of course the man with the hat is back, Chuck Mindenhall. He is, of course, of MMAfighting.com. All right, guys, let's talk about it. You know, Saturday night, a lot happened at UFC 171, but now, just a few days later, the big news is Johny Hendricks is going to be out for a while, and he's just another big UFC name who has an injury this year. Another champion out for the, for the foreseeable future. Has to have surgery on his bicep. Had a fractured chin as well in the fight. Now the big question is, all those guys who are vying for that title shot probably have to fight. They have to remain active. What do you do as far as the top of the UFC's welterweight division if you're the UFC brass?
You have to think that Johnny's injury is something of a blessing in disguise, because Tyron Woodley, I'm sure, was using his, probably bought an extra phone just to harass Dana White on WhatsApp or whatever. So him being out says, okay, we have to do this again. We have to have another set of eliminator fights. Listen, I mean, the reality is, you talk to people online, talk to journalists, you get a bunch of different responses. Oh, this is the way to go. No, this is the way to go. The truth is, there's not really a consensus about what to do. I think there's a lot of different permutations that would work for a lot of different needs. Some ideas are better than others. Me personally, I like a Nick Diaz versus Lawler match for a whole lot of reasons. It's a redemption fight, two guys coming off of losses. I like Tyron Woodley maybe versus... you could do even the winner of Jake Ellenberger, Tarek Saffiedine. You could do him versus Rory McDonald. You could do Hector Lombard versus Rory McDonald. You could do Hector Lombard versus Tyron Woodley. Any of those would potentially work. I just feel like you have to have another clear screening of these guys, because they're just, each of the resumes are great, and each of them are kind of fundamentally flawed. We have to get more great than flawed now.
It's a lot of fun, right? It's a lot different than a couple of years ago when it just felt it was like GSP and some other kind of bonus.
Oh yeah, and when Luke says blessing in disguise, obviously none of us ever want to wish injury or harm to any of the fighters. Well, except Chuck. Yeah, Chuck's a mean guy. But other than that, there was no guy that came out of Saturday and you said, okay, this is the one. So I remember thinking, okay, well, how are we gonna, who's gonna be the one to step forward? And it's gonna probably be somebody who talks a lot or somebody who makes a case, but nobody really has made a case, in terms of their resume yet. So this is an opportunity, but the UFC has to make the right fight. I think they have to make one fight that's a number one contender's fight. And the one I would go for would be Tyron Woodley against Rory McDonald. I just think those are the two guys that are vying there. But listening to Luke talk about those other guys, and every time he's saying another name, I'm thinking, yeah, I guess I could sort of hear that too. So, I mean, there's a lot of things out there, and this is a great time for this division. We sort of got spoiled with the dominance of George St. Pierre, but now we're about to be spoiled by a lot of fights between guys who are in the same boat.
Gentlemen, let me introduce a name to you guys.
Oh, here we go. Here we go.
Matt Brown is going to be fighting in Cincinnati. And, he's won 6 fights in a row. Now, you put Eric Silva on top of that. That's
who's unranked.
Who's unranked. But all 7 of those guys combined or something might maybe add up to somebody ranked right now.
Right.
But Matt Brown actually should be probably, because this whole pool of contenders is all vying in the same spot. Like we said, there's not a definitive guy. So I just want to throw Matt Brown's name in there as well.
But just one second, as a Matt Brown supporter, if you will, aren't you a little disappointed that he is fighting Eric Silva? Like, Eric Silva, this will be his 7th straight opponent who's not ranked. At some point, you got to give the guy, and I know he was supposed to fight Carlos Condit, but this isn't the fight that's going to propel him into that.
For him to have fought one of these guys who just came off of this card who'd won. I mean, it would have made so much more sense. It's just that they had this thing booked. It never looked, remember, he was supposed to fight Carlos Condit in December. That, to me, was like where he should be. He should be going up against a guy like that who might be finally a gateway for him to be in that contention talk. Though his biggest problem, obviously, is he does not fighting these contenders. But I'm just saying, if he's able to win that 7th one, he has in this pool of guys who we're talking about, he has every bit of right to be talking himself about, smiting his own chest, saying I deserve that shot. But ultimately, I'm with all of you guys. I think that it is a blessing in disguise. These guys. There are no clear cut. When Joe Rogan afterwards was talking about Rory McDonald as the guy, there was a lot of backlash with that, basically saying, why should he be the guy? You could go down every single one of their resumes and find flaws in it. Therefore, I believe, like, another round of that, and I would be with Jeff. I think Rory McDonald against Tyron Woodley is the one you look at as saying this could be the definitive one. The X factor is Nick Diaz, because I feel like they need guys who are going to be that star. And if you put him in a number one contender fight, obviously that adds a lot of intrigue for him, to have a big fight and then for potentially have him go into a fight against Johny Hendricks down the line.
Listen, MMA and boxing and combat sports are star-driven sports. You need stars. And so I don't think this division is going to be the same without Georges St. Pierre as it was when he was there. But I will say, like, for example, right now in Bellator, you look at their featherweights and lightweight divisions. Those are, I think, what most fans would say are their most exciting divisions. And it's not because they have stars, it's because there's parity at the top. Ooh, you've got Curran versus Pitbull, Pitbull versus Strauss versus Curran, and all those permutations are kind of fun and interesting. I think that's what you got going on right now at welterweight in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Secondly, though, I think that to me, there kind of was a guy, and that's all up for debate. I don't know, but for me, like, I think Tyron Woodley is an impressive dude, man. First of all, he was bodying Carlos Condit. I know Carlos Condit comes on late, and I think a 5-round fight would have been different, but his point is correct. He didn't lose a single minute of that fight, nothing. And on top of that, he goes out on that Monday. Most fighters are like, I don't want to talk to media, and is doing a media tour by his own volition and making the case and staying on message. And he does have history with Johny Hendricks, which you talked about on MMA Hour with you. Like, if you're asking me if they had to make a title fight, which they can't because Hendricks is out, I think that's the guy. If he beats Rory McDonald, you got to give Tyron Woodley the title shot.
Yeah, I agree with if they had to make one, if Hendricks were healthy and they had to make one, he would be the guy. But it wasn't clear-cut. Really, I thought the most dominant performance on Saturday night was Lombard. I mean, I've never seen anybody handle Jake Shields like he was like a little baby. It was like it was unbelievable.
And yet Joe Rogan wasn't impressed.
Well, I mean, I think he was impressed to an extent, but he obviously was questioning the guy's gas tank and his stamina and all that. But hey, I know that Rogan's got a lot of backlash, but he's an analyst. He's supposed to give an opinion, even if and it's okay for us to disagree with it.
Sure.
But that's your job. You're not Goldberg. You're not just doing the blow by blow. You're supposed to give some opinion, even if your opinion is one that a lot of people have problems with and can debate and would counteract and think is foolishness. He's doing his job.
You brought out the wild card that is Nick Diaz, and he was there. The UFC brought him out to Dallas, and not only did they bring him out, they were promoting him in the midst of Johny Hendricks almost, watching the title shot just, evaporate. I mean, Johny Hendricks is sweating bullets up there. He's trying to lose that last pound and a half. And their Twitter account is focused on Nick Diaz heckling him. I mean, it was a very bizarre scene, and it led me to believe that they're very high on Nick Diaz still, and they might even put him in that title shot. I mean, of course, the record doesn't merit a title shot, right? I mean, he's 0-2 in his last 2 fights, and both those were big fights. But you have to admit that you take all those guys that we've been talking about, you put them together, he's a bigger draw.
Yeah.
He makes more dollars than those guys do, right?
He lost 2 fights in a row, and he's had his issues. Obviously, when we're dealing in toxic airplane water, wolf ticks, the whole thing. Every time he does an event, it becomes its own event. The event within the event is like the Nick Diaz circus. But ultimately, when you look at his law, I mean, if you're really trying to justify it, which the UFC would need to do some of that a little bit to put the merit in place for him to be there. But his loss to Carlos Condit was a close one. A lot of people might have looked at that like maybe he even won that fight. I know that there was some controversy at the time. And then he lost to GSP, who everybody sort of felt like was a bad matchup for him anyway, that he was going to be on his back and he was going to have to find a way off of his back, which he wasn't able to do. Well, then you look at those 2 things and you think, is that the worst resume compared to other guys that we're talking about? For instance, Tyron Woodley, who I think he's gone 4-2 in his last 6 fights. He lost brutally to Nate Marquardt, for instance, or guys like that. You could go down and find instances in the recent history of all of them. It just so happens that he's his last 2 fights and all the baggage that goes with it. But ultimately, I'm just saying, like because he has that name, I feel like you don't need to justify the whole way through. You just know that he's Nick Diaz. I mean, he's Nick Diaz.
Throw him in there.
I mean, I'm always one for meritocracy in sports and all that, but I have to agree with Chuck in a way. I think that I would feel it would be really, really a bad idea if they put Diaz in the title fight right away. If, let's say, Hendricks were healthy and they said, we're going to go with Nick. I think it would be horrible to put a guy that's lost the last 2 fights. And if that were to happen, I would be sitting snickering on the sideline when Nick blew off his first press conference.
Right.
I would, it'd be like, karma. But if he goes out there and get beat any of those top guys, if they match him up with Woodley, or they match him up with McDonald, they match him up with Lombard, and he goes out and wins that fight, I'd have no problem. I mean, he's such a promotional boost for them, and that I think that if he can win one fight like that, more power to him.
In a year when they need events.
Yeah.
They do need events.
Well, also it'd be great if they had Ben Askren right now. Just saying. Just saying. Listen, I think that I don't know how you don't make that Lawler fight. Okay, rematch. So the two have history. It was a crazy fight the first time. It'd be a crazy fight the second time.
10
Sorry,
years later.
let me just say, Nick Diaz is an incredible talent. He's not going to beat Tyron Woodley. It's not going to happen. Okay, Tyron Woodley, like all other wrestlers, are going to do what they do and get in turtle position next to him and just beat on him. That's what they're going to do. Lawler will stand with him, and Lawler might win. I don't know. I mean, like Lawler's a better guy than he was, and Nick Diaz is a better guy than he was, and they fought the first time. But it's a style that's accommodating. And I had a question people were putting to me, and I'm sure you got the same one, which was how many fights does Nick Diaz need to win before he gets a title shot? And my thought just intuitively was 2, with one condition. If he beats Lawler and stops him dramatically, let's say the way he beat BJ Penn, people would be, like The Walking Dead, shaking the gates, trying to get into the prison. Like, this is the match to make. So I don't know how you don't make that Lawler rematch.
But he also, you discount the idea of him fighting Woodley. Well, whoever he fights next, if he then gets a title shot, he's then in against a wrestler. So why not just throw him in there? I don't have a case to make for Woodley, for McDonald, or for Lombard, whoever. I mean, Lawler, throw all those guys in the mix. Any one of them is fine, but I wouldn't take any of them out of the mix just because it's a wrestler who we think, well, maybe Nick would have problems with him.
But my point is, like, Lawler just lost, and I thought it was, I scored it for Hendricks, but I could see how someone would be like, okay, let's see how
It wasn't a
Lawler
robbery, though.
No, not a robbery, not by any stretch of
Close
imagination,
fight.
but I think people thought that Lawler was close to winning that. If Diaz goes in there and beats him in a way that Hendricks couldn't,
100%.
you're like, oh, here's your credibility.
Right.
But the thing about it is, like, what if you're going to put wrestlers in front of Nick Diaz, just go and say you're not going to give him a title shot, because listen, it sounds like I'm hating on the guy, but he just does not have a great history against wrestling. He just doesn't. It's not like Carlos Condit will work the rest of his life on takedown defense. It's never going to happen for him. It's just not in the cards for him. So for me, if you're going to have the guy come back and make use of him, put him in a title shot. But a couple things you have to do ahead of time. That Lawler fight to me just seems like the easiest path.
That is what makes you a champion. I mean, you have to be able. These guys have to be able to compete against. Same as like you mentioned Ben Askren. Well, if you're putting Ben Askren in the cage with somebody. And let's say see if he were in the UFC, put him in the top 5. Well, you're going to want to put him in with a guy who's a striker. See if he can handle a guy like that.
I'm just saying over time, like that's the way you have to do it. But if you in a year where it's this is the salad days, you gotta cut some corners a little bit. Not all of them, but I just feel like if you're gonna let's put some wrestlers in front of them. It's like, oh man, come on.
That's true.
Chuck, what do you make of GSP saying to Johny Hendricks, stick around for a bit? Is he going to? I mean, it sounds to me like he's pretty close. No, I mean, am I looking into it too much? He keeps telling us that he's taking a break, but to say to the guy, flatly, stick around for a bit, and I might come back. This doesn't sound like a guy that's not going to fight again, right?
Yeah, I mean, I caught that too, and it's interesting. It depends on which day it seems like you're following this saga of GSP. Sometimes it seems like he's coming out, and Dana White saying it's a certainty he's coming back. Then he throws, it's less certain he's coming back. But ultimately, I still think he's coming back because he's still a young guy. Eventually, he'll get that hunger in him again to do this. And especially, I think, if Johny Hendricks were to run the table for a little bit anyway, win a couple of fights, and a lot of people thought that Johny Hendricks beat GSP, that fight was so close. I think that it would be like the old Matt Hughes thing. It would go back to those days. It would be a little bit of that again. Like, you've got this guy who's like a rival just by, he took your spot, and now he's winning fights, and you're the guy coming back. It would just make for a really big fight. And honestly, I think that would sort of drive him back in at some point.
Is GSP handling this the right way in the sense that he keeps telling us that unless things change, he's not coming back, but he's not telling us what he wants to be changed. And even when asked about, all right, the commission doing this and that, he's like, no, it's not up to the commission. Well, who is it up to? It feels like this is like when he walked away and said, I have to make a point, I have to walk away, but I can't tell you why. That just leads to more speculation, more questions, more people bothering him. He's not. At this point, he said what he had to say, but either you're going to do something about it or not do something about it. It feels like right now he's kind of not really sure where to go with it, and he's actually making it more difficult on himself.
Yeah, it's crazy. You ask him, like, what's the problem? He's like, well, it's not the UFC, it's not the commission, it's the system. It's like saying, what's bothering you? The man. Like, the man's holding me down. What does that even mean, like, the system? The system is nothing but the actors interacting.
Right.
That's what the system is. So, I mean, is he saying VADA? Like, should VADA play a more prominent role? Should he have...
He doesn't say that.
Right, I know. So, like, I think you're right. I think on the one hand, it's good to raise awareness, which I think he's done. He's certainly raised awareness. Okay, fair enough. But unless
that only goes so far.
That only goes so far. Unless you have not a series of demands exactly, but like there's a certain conditions. There's a climate that has to be there, and unless sort of X, Y, and Z are really fundamentally changed in some kind of measurable, demonstrable way, then I don't want to do this. But what he's saying is the system needs to be fixed. Well, what?
Yeah.
Like, okay, then how do you fix the system, George? Oh, well, you have to have an independent body. Okay, in what way? All fights? All title fights? All your fights? Really have to prescribe a plan of action. Until he has a plan of action, I'm sympathetic to him, but I can't really follow him. I don't know where to go.
Yeah, I get the same feeling that it's almost as though he doesn't know exactly what he wants. He knows he doesn't like what's happening now, and he probably can imagine what it would be like if it were better, but he has no route to get there. I didn't infer as much, though, as you did in his answer to Hendricks. I just take it that he's a guy who isn't sure what his future is, and he's not ready to say, I'm done. So yeah, stick around for a while. We'll see. It wasn't like stick around, I'll meet you down the end of the block. It was more, at least I took it as, who knows, the future. I get the feeling that he is, maybe more than he's done in the past, living in the moment. He seemed happy when he was on with you the other day, and it's as though some weight has been lifted off his shoulders, and he has certain complaints, but he's not really quite ready to articulate or really sort of stress himself enough to get into it again.
I like that GSP is still basically what he was. He's sort of opened up this new idea, these bigger ideas of what's going on, but now we still are guessing at what really is going through his mind, just like we were when we were interviewing him for fights when he wasn't telling us nearly half of the story where he's at now. So it's like, it's just a further extension of what's going on in GSP's mind, ultimately. But I personally just think at some point he probably has other issues he's dealing with. I think that this is just what people are fixated on, the things like this, and he's letting it be there. But I still feel like there are other issues going on in his life probably at the same time that he's trying to work out before he decides to get back in there.
One last thing about UFC 171. Johny Hendricks is the new champion. How big of a star, how big of a draw can he be? He seems, in my opinion, like the second coming of Matt Hughes. They haven't had this kind of country boy. He doesn't show up with the suit, wears his hat, spits in the bottle. He's really a country guy, and there are a lot of people who relate to that. But how big of a star can he be, in your opinion?
I don't know. What is he, 30, 31?
Yeah.
Time is not on his side. I'm not saying he's declining by any stretch, but he doesn't have, like when George was champion, he was 25. The world was his oyster at the time. And I think Hughes was relatively young when he took the title, maybe 27, 28, something like that. So time is not on his side. I certainly feel like he's got a lot of athletic pedigree you could bank on. I think he is the best guy in the division, not just a guy that happens to wear the title. But I don't know. I don't think the current climate of MMA, unless you're a really breakout, brash kind of guy, I think he can carve out a niche. I think he can get a subset of people who you're talking about, blue collar Americana. He can grab them, but I don't know that he can grab all the audiences. George St. Pierre could grab everybody. Men, women, white, black, Hispanic. Everyone kind of wanted to see, what's this guy GSP going to do? I think certainly Johny Hendricks is a remarkable talent, but I don't know that he can cross boundaries in the same kind of way.
One of the interesting stories to follow over the past week has been the UFC's flirtation with Holly Holm. And if you're just a casual UFC fan, you don't know who Holly Holm is, but if you follow the sport like we do, you know about her not only in MMA, but what she has done in boxing. And you know that Mike Winkeljohn and Greg Jackson have been working with her for quite some time, since she was a teenager, especially Mike Winkeljohn. Well, Dana White drops a subtle bombshell of sorts, right before UFC 171, when he said that he was going to talk to her manager at the event. And then he says this week that meeting did not go well and that he has no interest in her whatsoever anymore. And this is very reminiscent of a few weeks ago when he said the same thing about Gilbert Melendez. Does the UFC need Holly Holm right now? It seems like this is actually all kind of a good thing for Holly Holm. She's being talked about a lot these days, and she's never fought in the UFC and never really fought anyone of note, but yet we talk about her and we're interested in her and we want to see her fight the top 135 pounders. Do you think they need her? Does she have a position of power here?
Whatever happened to that Melendez guy, though? Because once
it
Dana dismissed his manager, he must have gone off somewhere. I don't know.
Faded into obscurity.
Yeah, we don't even have it. Now, I don't think that the UFC needs Holly Holm right now because, Ronda Rousey has Kat Zingano sitting out there waiting for her chance. And if she gets by that challenge, then she'll get the slim down Cyborg, waiting for her then. So she's pretty much set for...
Guaranteed.
Right.
This thing's set.
There are the opportunities for a couple of fights. We have to make sure that Zingano's ready to go, and of course they have to, get Cyborg on board. But those are a couple of fights that are there. So right now, I don't think they need to have Holly Holm around. But once those two fights go away, let's say that Rousey gets through both of them, man.
Not to mention Alexis Davis, who's
also sitting around there. Yeah. But I think those are the two fights that really. Sure. I mean, Zingano definitely earned hers. So when she's ready, she gets her shot, and everybody wants a Cyborg fight. But after that, then there was all this lull. Like, okay, well, she gets by Cyborg. Who can take her on? Well, maybe somebody who's really good at another dimension of martial arts, not a grappler, but somebody who could do something else at a very high level. So then it becomes a whole different issue.
What was the reasoning for there not being women's MMA for so long? It was because there was no divisional depth, right? That you didn't want to bring in there was no divisional depth. To me, I'm like, this is how you've got to get people like Holly Holm in there, because that's exactly what you're trying to do, is establish that depth, especially even if it's depth of perception. Because if she's out there and people know who she is, she's been sort of steadily coming along. I think she has, six pro fights so far, but she has the pedigree, boxing history, very decorated. It's like you got a perfect opportunity to bring somebody in who could be in the wings for something like that, and you have depth in that division. Whether you want to turn those, Alexis Davis against Holly Holm or something like that, or play with the order, but at least you have more names, because there's no guarantees with people like Cyborg. She sort of falls into that same gray area of, will that ever happen? Gina Carano, we don't, who knows what that's all about, if that was ever even true, where that was going. But to me, I'm like, this is how you establish depth, is you get the biggest names, whether it's perception or real, and I think she's real, obviously, like what she's, her pedigree with Winklejohn and everything else, and you put her in there, because honestly, that's exciting. When you think about that division, the more names that are in there, the better. So I hope that they work something out ultimately. I feel like the UFC could really use her.
And the stars seem to align, because they're going to Albuquerque. She's a huge draw in Albuquerque. In June, you'd think that would be a perfect spot for her to debut. But what do you make, Luke, once again, of this sort of, Dana White versus manager feud that has not just been playing out for the last couple of weeks? I mean, it's really been playing out for years, and it will play out for years and years to come. But often when he says this, things turn. Lorenzo takes over. We've seen this play out. I mean, is it fair to say that the Holly Holm dream of fighting in the UFC isn't necessarily dead just because he said that?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily dead. It's probably dead for now.
Right.
We'll see what happens if they have let's say they have a rash of bad injuries that ruins. Remember, it was the card they lost the main event and the co-main event in the same day, the Brazil card where they had Rampage fall out and all that. Like, imagine something like that happens. I might be like, well, where's Mrs. Holm's phone number? We have some business to attend to. So I certainly would keep that in mind. I just think it's interesting. It's a year where UFC needs headliners, and they're pushing this away. It's kind of remarkable. They're sticking to their guns, but. I saw fans online, and some of this was based on her manager's comments of we want to make sure she gets paid. Boy, she's got some nerve trying to get paid, huh? And I saw fans being like, oh, she's asking too much. That's not what she's worth. What experience does she have? It's like, you fools. What you're worth is what you can negotiate. And I hope she can, not just at UFC, any promoter, rake them over the coals. Right? If you have an ability to make money in this game in that little tiny window that Dana White always talks about, and listen, Dana White versus managers, they have competing interests. They're going to butt heads.
Sure,
right?
she's 32 years old. Right. It's not like she's, it's
not
like she's
exactly.
25.
Right. And then she has the nerve to ask for money, like in a year where, if you're Holly Holm's manager, why wouldn't you ask for money? You have this situation where you have your best star ever needs people to fight against. There's general organic enthusiasm. You can sell it. You'd be a fool not to ask for money. So in the end, maybe she went too far, and I think that in the end, fighters should be able to ask for every penny they can milk out of a promoter.
And you've used the term ask several times. You mentioned negotiation. This is what this is about, and it makes me wonder. Well, if now we're starting to see the UFC brass bristle at the suggestion of a manager that maybe this fighter should be paid more money than they're willing to pay out. Maybe in the past, some of the managers have been a little too cozy with the UFC, because it is sort of the only major league game in town. So if you want to be at the top level, you're gonna do business with these guys. But now, as there's more money involved, and some other managers are getting involved, maybe they're starting to say, okay, here's what we're gonna ask for this amount. And the UFC is gonna have this is their offer, and it doesn't mean that this is the amount that we're gonna settle on. Maybe they settle somewhere in the middle, and that's just the way business is done.
And Dana White is saying, he's been, before UFC 170, Ronda Rousey was our biggest star. This was like the thing, like, Ronda Rousey, is she the biggest? Well, she's the biggest star. She's the biggest star. Well, you need to find her. If she's going to be your biggest star, you need to find people like Holly Holm to bring in, honestly, to keep her in that spot. Otherwise, literally go down the list. There's really not. We're just talking about the 170 division and all the different possibilities. We didn't even mention Gastelum and all the guys who are just kind of coming up below. There's just nobody else there. They're sort of existing in that gray area middle where they're beating one another, and it's going in a vicious cycle. There's nobody down there, and I feel like she should be negotiating high because she's one of those people you could bring in, and there's an automatic appeal to what might happen if she crosses paths with Rousey.
And we also understand that the previous negotiation that resulted in Ben Askren not ending up in the UFC. As much as all of us agree very, very strongly that Askren deserves to be in the UFC and should be there if they're going to say that they're the best, they're the best fighting the best. We understand why they didn't bring him in, because his fighting style is one that they perceive as being a turnoff for fans. Well, Holly Holm is a stand-up fighter. She's a striker. This is the kind of person you want to bring in, not just from a competitive standpoint, but also from just the entertainment standpoint. So negotiate, work something out.
And the thing is, this is about Holm versus Rousey. This is not exactly like, this is different than the Gilbert Melendez situation in two fundamental ways. One, Gilbert was going to be added to a division that was not deep for Bellator, but is one of Bellator's deeper ones, especially against Alvarez Chandler. You could think of some of the permutations there. But Holm suffers from the fact that there's no real competitor for her. Like, Gilbert was able to say, okay, I'm going to get an offer from Bellator and I'm going to put it in front of UFC's face. She can't really do that anywhere else.
There's nowhere else.
So she's kind of hamstrung. Now, she still has a card to play, which is, of course, everything we've talked about before. But, if there was already an established division for her in Bellator, I bet you that UFC would be rethinking that very, very much.
The only other card she can play is boxing and say, I could go back to boxing now and make this.
But LOL.
Right, exactly. She's in a tougher spot than Melendez was, that is for sure. Now, some pretty shocking news earlier this week, in my opinion, was that Duane Bang Ludwig, the man many people thought was the coach of the year for 2013, parting ways with Team Alpha Male effective May 24th. And sometimes I ask this question on this show, and other people who aren't here get a little annoyed. I ask about what's this person's legacy. But we've talked about on this show about how good that team was before he came on board, and how the real indicator as to how much of a difference he would make is if he could get them over that hump. They already fought in the title fights. They never won the titles. And with him, they fought in the title fights, didn't win the titles. Looking back, and especially now that they're parting ways, was this a little too much hype? Did Duane Bang Ludwig really do all that much for Team Alpha Male?
I think there's a lot of dispute about it. There's a lot. You get a lot of the guys, the really hardcore nuts, who will say, if you look at the strength of schedule they had during the Bang Ludwig era, I guess you want to call it that,
sure,
they would say that the reason why their success rate was better was because they were fighting guys who weren't as tough, with some exceptions, particularly in the case of Uriah Faber and later, against McDonald, for example, right? But generally speaking, look at some of the guys Chad Mendez fought. Like, Mendez was like a minus 1,000 favorite against what was his name?
Cody McKenzie.
Yeah, Cody McKenzie. I mean, like, what? So there is that argument. I just thought that it's a little unfair. I think that is Duane Ludwig Yoda? Is he some amazing must-have talent? I think it's probably up for debate. But he was an important piece for the development of that team. One, they never had a head coach, so now they know that they have to have it, even if they can't have Duane Ludwig. He helped establish the truth of architecture. I think more importantly, and I mentioned this before, like, Team Alpha Male is a very strange team. You go to American Top Team, they have 1 million welterweights and light heavyweights, and they got Justin Scoggins and everybody else. This is all little guys who are wrestle boxers. You get a coach who has something that they're all missing, namely striking and sort of general MMA awareness. He can produce quality at scale. He can do it across the whole team. So he was really helpful, I think, for all those guys. There is some data to suggest that, for example, Uriah Faber was much more accurate in terms of his striking, post Duane Ludwig than he was before that. So listen, did he get him over the hump? Did he fix all the things that ails him? No. But was he a fundamental shift in the development of that team and those guys' careers? I think the answer to that one is pretty clearly yes.
Yeah, I thought it was a symbiotic relationship. On the one hand, Ludwig brought this striking acumen to this sort of grappling heavy team. And the other side of it is they brought this really great success, particularly 2013, to him, and he becomes coach of the year. So now he emerges as kind of a bit of a star coach. And they, I don't know that I'm not sure, you may be right, their status may not have been elevated too much, but it's kind of given them a little bit more juice in that they are not just a team that's going to come out there and take you down and beat you up, but they can also take you out on the feet as well. So I guess it's maintained their legitimacy, kept them in the talk as a top team, and it certainly has elevated him. So wherever he goes now, whatever he decides to do now, he's got a little bit more a little more excitement around him.
And honestly, it's sort of smart, because if we are sitting here debating what his merit is, how much he had an influence, well, perceptively he did do this. That's where he's at. Strike while the iron's hot. If he's going to monetize it and put his name on something, which right now he doesn't really have, he's a coach at Team Alpha Male. Well, now he has his own gym in Colorado. I visited him in Colorado before. I've seen sort of like how he operates his classes and stuff with Trevor Whitman and all the guys out there. He wants his own school. This is the best time for him to actually bring people to his school, is when he's known as the coach of the year. Suddenly he's got appeal. He can go back, have his gym, be in his home state of Colorado, have his family. To me, it makes sense. When I heard it, I was like, of course he was going to do that. Because it's just like anybody else. As soon as you have that buzz, do something with it. Don't let it go away. Then this next year, his guys may go, some of his guys may lose, and we're not talking about Duane Ludwig.
And he always said that it was kind of a year-by-year thing.
Yeah.
He always said that this was not permanent. Yeah. It just felt like it came out of the blue.
Right.
I don't know. For some reason, I wasn't expecting it, because they were doing so well. And Mendez has a title shot probably coming up, and Faber lost that one controversially.
Sort of.
It just felt like it kind of came out of the blue.
It was almost out of the blue when he went there and to begin with. So all of it just seems like a strange coming together and a strange parting.
I haven't talked to Faber or Mendez, but I bet you that the feeling, at least from Duane's side certainly, was that he set them up with a roadmap for success. You have to find the right guy to fill in for him, which is no easy task, but group practices have to run this way, and camps have to be run this way, and training has to look a certain way, and filling in all these details when you have these problems, they have to be done a certain way. I think he gave them all of those pieces. It's up to them to carry that forward.
Very interesting to see who they bring in. Uriah told me some names like Mark Hominick and Dan Hardy are on his wish list, and how that guy does, because if they go on another great streak, who knows how Duane will be perceived. So it's going to be...
Forget the fight. I just want to see Uriah in the purple mohawk. That's going to be pretty awesome.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the problem. Like, if they set themselves up for all these title shots, Faber's out now, but you got Chad Mendez. He's probably going to face Jose Aldo. If he loses, everyone's going to say, well, he was fighting Cody McKenzie when he was with Duane. Like, the poor bastard has to take over for him, and they have to go against Jose Aldo. Like, there's a lose-lose, man.
Okay, final thing that we must talk about. The UFC is billing it as the most anticipated rematch in UFC history.
I'm hot under the collar, Eric Holm.
It's Dan Henderson versus Shogun 2. Of course, we can't deny the fact that their first fight was one of the greatest of all time. UFC 139, one of the greatest nights in UFC history because of Eddie Alvarez and Michael Chandler. The Henderson-Shogun fight took place at the HP Pavilion in San Jose. It was a great back-and-forth war, 5-round fight when those were fresh as far as non-title main events. And now here we are, a couple of years later. Henderson's on a 3-fight losing streak. Shogun showed glimpses of the old Shogun against James Tahuna, and we're getting this fight on a Sunday evening on free television, 2 or 3 months after the Weidman Silva fight that was at the time the most anticipated. It doesn't feel like this is really the most anticipated rematch in UFC history. Do you disagree?
It's a fight so important, they're not even going to sell it to you.
Right.
That's how this is the one, man. Like, you just think about UFC rematches, it's like, this is bigger than St. Pierre Hughes 2. This is bigger than Lesnar Mir 2. This is bigger. What? Like, they're just making stuff up now on these things. These are the 2 tallest men in the world. Oh, I gotta see the 2 tallest men in the world fight. That's what it feels like. I'm not saying it's going to be a bad fight. Actually, I'm reasonably interested in seeing it. But
for nostalgia reasons, right? You kind of want to see how the 6th round goes.
And also, I think the reality is that first fight, Dan Henderson dominated early and then faded late. Shogun took over late. There's a question about what guys might look like. If Henderson loses 4 in a row, that's a significant event. So I'm mocking some of the marketing of it, but it's not an insignificant contest. I think my only issue is, it's just the feel to me is that they've got a million shows going on and a million cards to fill. They were just like, we got to make it. We got to have something. So let's put it together. Let's put some marketing behind it and see what happens. But I just don't think, from what I'm reading, could be wrong. We'll see. And they always do good ratings on FS1. Fans aren't biting on it. I think.
Do you blame them though? Do you blame them for using that? You can't deny the fact that it was one of the best fights ever. So, I remember last weekend I was. Around a television where these other people were watching, and they were watching NASCAR on Fox. This commercial probably came up like 3-4 times, the Henderson Shogun one. And I don't usually see commercials like this on Fox. And it kept saying the most anticipated. So do you blame them? I mean, that's marketing, right? That's
it is marketing, but I'm always wary of that kind of stuff. I was one who was a little upset that Francis Ford Coppola was going to make another Godfather, and look what happened. We got one of the great movies ever. I almost wish that we could divorce this fight from the first one, because I don't want this to sully my memory of that first one. Like one of you guys said, round 6. I almost don't want to think of it that way. I want to just think of it as like that was just such a fun thing to watch, and now we've got another fight. These two guys are going to come back in there. Neither one of them is anywhere near the title chase. They're semi-relevant, but they're both really tough guys, and we're in this to watch tough guys fight, and they've done it before, so we know it's not going to be like a feeling out process. So there's a lot of things that might go right. I just want to sort of sit back and say, okay, let's just watch it, but I don't want to have much expectation.
I think that relevance is really the thing, because when you look back at UFC 139 where these guys first fought, there was real relevance to that fight. Dan Henderson, if he won, everybody knew that he possibly could be facing Jon Jones, and that's, I think, who he was saddled to fight next, was Jon Jones. So for that fight to kind of go down the way it did, it held some, more magnificence because of the stakes that were there. Well, Jon Jones has since sort of rendered everybody moot. These guys have all, lost along the way. Now Dan Henderson's on a, 3-fight skid. Shogun hasn't looked the same. He's lost 2 out of 3, and they're going to fight in this Sunday night. To me, it's just really the relevance of it. Neither guy, whoever wins this fight, just basically stays around, I think, in that division for now. But ultimately, nobody's near a title shot. Nobody probably is going to get a title shot out of this group. So it just loses something. So it's like you're really looking at, well, these guys really threw down the first time. Let's hope that they do it again. And if that makes it the most anticipated, I guess that's where we're at on it, is hoping for another good encounter with less stakes.
It almost feels like there would be more buzz for this fight if it was like the co-main event of UFC 172. The fact that it's on a Sunday and for free, I feel like some people aren't. I don't know. It's like a weird thing.
You want to see CB Dollaway in that headlining spot, don't you?
I do. I really do. 5 rounds, him and Muchanchi. That's great. How do you feel about the Sunday night UFC event?
Oh, I'm okay with that. I mean, any break I think is fine. I was always like, I know it didn't work for them, and I understand why they did it. I was always a big fan of the Wednesday night fights. I always think it's kind of fun to come home from work or the office and be able to turn on the thing and watch live fights, and especially if there is a good card. I mean, this one's not the greatest one in the world, but they've certainly put on great Tuesday and Wednesday night cards. WEC used to do that. WEC used to be on Sundays too. Mm-hmm. So I like the break from Saturday and the break from Friday. I think any kind of variety in MMA is always better.
And one interesting thing that people aren't really talking about as far as Dan Henderson is concerned, they talk about, okay, this is the last time that someone's going to use TRT, at least for now. But he is on a 3-fight losing streak. I mean, could this be it? Could this be the last time we watch Dan Henderson? Because I feel like that narrative has come up with other guys. It really hasn't come up at all as far as, and maybe that's just, a byproduct of this coming right off of UFC 171 and us really having a week to digest this card. But do you think there's a chance we might see Dan Henderson for the last time on Saturday? Sunday.
I think there's a chance, because there's 2 chances. One is that he could look bad and the UFC can sort of say goodbye to him, but he also might say, well, I'm not going to not fight on TRT. He might, he has come out and said that, that his health is they all say this, but he's come out and, talked about how I don't abuse it, but this is something that I really need. I'm going to have to find some other way of doing this. But he might just say, enough is enough.
The funny thing about Dan Henderson, he's always been an anomaly. I don't feel like we ever look at Dan Henderson the same. We don't look at the TRT use the same because his body doesn't look as different as maybe Vitor Belfort. We don't look at his record. I don't know. It's strange with him. And even on this, a 3-fight losing streak, well, clearly he needs to win this fight. Otherwise, it'll be 4 fights at his age. All those questions will be there for real. But you look back at the guys that the Machida fight, Machida sort of didn't engage, and Rashad fight, it could have gone either way. It was only, and then he got caught against Vitor Belfort. To me, this is finally one of those ones where you're like, if he looks bad, this could be the writing on the wall for Dan Henderson, which is kind of crazy, because at one point, he could have made a claim as being one of the greatest fighters of all time. When he was getting ready to go in against, looking at his resume and where he had been, who he'd beat, the types of, holding two belts and pride, everything else, coming over to the UFC, fighting for its belts twice. It was like he had done so much compared to most guys that if he were to go in and have beaten Jon Jones, for instance, which was a long shot, but if he had done that, we could have maybe been considering him, maybe the best fighter that had ever been. I mean, he's getting close.
Mount Rushmore, if you can do that, right? I mean,
yeah, he would be up there. So it's crazy how like a small turn, and here we are now. He's silently 3-fight losing streak, and maybe this could be it.
And what a difference a knockout makes, because going into the Tahuna fight for Shogun, everyone was talking about if he loses this one, we want to see him down at 185. I still want to see him down at 185. I feel like this is the time to do that. I mean, right now he's, let's just say John Jones beats Glover, and then he has to fight, Gustafsson, and then he has to fight maybe Daniel Cormier. He's not going to get a title shot anytime soon. I want to see a revamped Shogun, and I still feel like there's some fat that he can lose there. Does that not interest you at all?
Totally. And you see these guys who were previously at 205, now at 185, like with Machida, and you're like, oh, damn.
Right.
And also, I mean, light heavyweight just kind of blows right now, and middleweight is kind of good. And so, middleweight it's good for like the first 10, then it drops off pretty significantly. But if you can get another guy in there, another 2 guys in there, they can really sort of fill out that top 10, top 15 in a very nice way. I agree that he could be even faster, have great power. He is the guy that wrote the blueprint on beating Machida, by the way.
Right.
Everyone's like, how's Chris Weidman going to do? Shogun might do pretty well against old Machida. So I can totally agree with you. And plus, whenever you change weight classes, and if you can do it especially off of a win, so if he gets a win against Dan Henderson, there's always like new excitement, new life. You get one more turn of the screw. So I completely agree that 185 would be a great choice, but I guess he just wants to eat that acai. I don't know.
Yeah,
So do I, by the way.
Setting aside my resentment toward you for pointing out somebody's fat and suggesting that he loses somebody,
Well,
I do think that there's more opportunity at 185 for him. So, when you get to a certain age, you got to chase the opportunity. If he has to go cut down a bantamweight, he'll cut down a bantamweight. But you got to do what you got to do.
Just the opposite. I'd like to see him at heavyweight at some point before he hangs. No, I'm kidding.
That would be interesting. Maybe an open weight situation. He did well.
But also remember, he was out of 185 for a while, I think because his brother was there.
That's true.
Now his brother's been gone for a long time now, so it's like
running his gas station.
Right, and there's yeah, right, and there's nothing stopping him from going. So that I know of.
You even think if he beats Dan Henderson, there's no logical guy for him next. Like, this is a fun fight. It doesn't necessarily make all that much sense because he's coming off a win, Henderson 3. But it's fine. I have no problem with the matchmaking. Yeah. But then you think about what could be waiting for him at 185. It's a lot more interesting, in my opinion.
Matchmaking is difficult in MMA, but in some ways it's not so difficult. Like, where is the wind at your back? Holly Holm should go to fight Ronda Rousey because the wind is at her back. The wind for Shogun is sort of pushing him towards middleweight. Like, wherever fans kind of want to see you, I don't think you have to give in to all fan demands.
Sure.
But when it makes sense for you and it makes sense for them, and that's where the interest is, follow it, man.
And it's funny, we were all pining for him to go to 185 before the fight. Does a knockout really change all that much? You know what I mean? We were pining for him to go to 185 before knocking out Tahuna. Why should just one simple knockout change it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you wanted it before, why don't you want it now?
I don't know. I can't. I have to ask Mr. Alonso or Mr. Hula.
Or Mr. White.
Or Mr. White.
All right, well, that does it for us. Of course, the UFC returns this Sunday. Of course, there's also Bellator this Friday on Spike TV. And if you want to talk about anything we discussed on today's show, leave us a question or comment in the comment section below. And here's one for the commenters. I've been meaning to bring this up for quite some time. You've been wondering if there's anything in here. There is. Let's all take a, why not? Cheers to it. Here it is.
My absence.
There it is. There, water, right there. Here we go. Because they always bring this up. Wow. Is there anything even in there?
I made this in my tub.
Yeah, there's something. We won't tell you what, but it's liquidy. You just saw it right there. That does it for us. We'll be back next week for a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. Thank you so much for watching. For Luke, Jeff, Chuck, I'm Ariel Helwani. We'll see you next week right here on the MMA Beat.